How did the rugged coast of Oregon lead to a science fiction classic? Stick around and find out. If you're a fan of the new Dune film starring Timothée Chalamet and directed by Denis Villeneuve, you're probably aware that they're based on the book of the same name written by Frank Herbert and published in 1965. But what you might not know is the origin of the story goes back to the 1950s, and the inspiration for its main character goes all the way back to World War I. In 1957, Frank Herbert was an Oregon journalist and part-time fiction writer with a handful of published stories under his belt and one novel, The Dragon in the Sea, that was critically well received but not a commercial success. Herbert had grown up poor but curious and was widely read, and by the late 1950s had developed strong interests in a range of topics, including psychology, Zen Buddhism, the exploitation of natural resources, and psychedelic mushrooms, all of which would feed into Dune's creation. In 1957, he flew to the Oregon coast to research a story idea. The U.S. Department of Agriculture had developed new techniques to stabilize sand dunes, and they were using these methods to corral the famous Oregon dunes near Florence, Oregon. The dunes there are ancient, over 100,000 years old, and over 40 miles long, and their untamed natural state threatened everything around them. Herbert recognized the importance of this development ecologically, as it could keep larger deserts, such as the Sahara, from damaging their surrounding environments. He wrote a detailed proposal and sent it to his agent. He wrote, "Wind-driven dunes have swallowed whole cities and towns from ancient times down to modern times. Here are only a few of the communities that have fought a losing battle with sand: Merzek in the Sahara, Washari and a string of other settlements in the Kumtag Desert in Xinjiang, hundreds of towns along the Hadramout coast of Arabia." But despite Herbert's passion for the subject, his agent was unimpressed. "American editors don't give a damn about Merzek and Kumtag," he said. "They don't even know what those names mean." Herbert never finished the article, and that might have been the end of it. But like a grain of sand that becomes a pearl, it was just the beginning. He kept working on the idea of a desert planet and folding in other areas of his interests. His fascination with psychedelic mushrooms inspired melange, the spice of the Dune world that heightens awareness and extends life. His admiration for author William Faulkner inspired the complex genealogies of the family houses in the novel. And when he developed his hero, Paul Atreides, he looked back to another famous desert adventurer, T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, whose 1926 book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, documented his time serving as a military advisor to the Bedouins in their revolt against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Paul's ESP powers were inspired by Herbert's reading of psychic researcher J.B. Rhine. The Bedouins themselves inspired the Fremen of his novel, and Herbert also adopted various Arabic words into the world of Dune, as well as ideas from Islam, largely taken from the 14th century encyclopedia Kitab al-Ibar by Arab sociologist and historian Ibn Khaldun. Another source of inspiration was the 1960 book The Sabres of Paradise by British historian Leslie Blanch. The book covers the 19th century conflict between the Russian Empire and the tribes they sought to conquer in the Caucasus region of Eastern Europe. Herbert also adopted language from this conflict into Dune. All of these ideas fed into Herbert's concept, and by 1962 he had developed a detailed outline for a story he called Spice Planet. Not the greatest title, but he soon abandoned the outline when he realized the story held the promise of a vaster and richer literary world. He went back to the drawing board. By spring 1963, he had an early draft of the story, now called Dune World, and after some tweaking, it was accepted for publication in serial form at Analog Magazine by editor John W. Campbell. Campbell wrote Herbert in a letter, "Congratulations, you are now the father of a 15-year-old Superman." Herbert was paid 3 cents a word, $2,550, minus commission. Oh, and if the name John W. Campbell rings a bell, it may be because you remember him as a legend in the field of science fiction, or as the author of the 1938 classic Who Goes There, which is better known today by the title of its second film adaptation, The Thing. Meanwhile, Herbert's agent was trying to find a book publisher to publish Dune as a novel and was having very little luck. A quick word about Herbert's agent, Lurton Blassingame. Blassingame had been a literary agent since the 1920s and had represented multiple heavy hitters in American popular literature and pulp fiction, and if he couldn't find a home for Dune, then no one could. He's every bit as legendary as John Campbell in the field of science fiction, but he also represented authors in other genres. In fact, the famous horror collection Dark Forces, which features the very first publication of Stephen King's The Mist, is actually dedicated to him. But no publisher seemed to want the book, largely due to its length, unique setting, and heavy world building. One editor turned it down with the remark, "We may be making the mistake of the decade." Eventually, over 20 publishers turned the novel down. The story, however, is still appearing serialized in analog and is gathering fans. And one fan in particular was in a position to make something happen. Sterling Lanier had been reading the story in analog and wanted to publish 3 Dune segments in a single hardcover and call it simply Dune. Not only that, he wanted even more material, not cuts. And Lanier was an editor at a major publisher, Chilton Books. And if that publisher doesn't sound familiar to you, you're probably not a mechanic, because Chilton is best known as the publisher of automotive repair manuals. But Lanier was a science fiction author himself, and a visionary in his own way. The offer was quickly accepted, $7,500 and future royalties. Chilton published the first edition and started promoting the release. They even bought radio ads. And while reviews were positive, sales were slow, and soon, like many others who were ahead of their time, Lanier was out of a job because of it. The book, however, continued to sell, and future editions and sequels followed. Dune is now considered a science fiction classic and has been translated into dozens of languages and has sold over 20 million copies. Herbert wrote 5 more Dune books, and his son, Brian Herbert, along with a noted science fiction author Kevin J. Anderson, has added to the story using his father's notes. Frank Herbert died in 1986, but he lived long enough to see the first film adaptation of his work, directed by David Lynch, hit the big screen in 1984. And now, with the success of the new films, Herbert's initial worries about the sand seem prophetic. Dune is indeed taking over the world. Cheers.